finding the tech enablement within clinical trials. What are the use cases and which companies are addressing them? How do you get to a point where you are able to implement these types of AI tech-enabled solutions where you are truly a pharma tech company to the point where pharma is almost unrecognizable and becomes just purely a pharma tech company through all of this? I think that's really, really exciting and important. I don't think anyone has a solid answer.
I'm Pedro Coelho, your host, and this is The End Talks. In this episode, Parachute or Unicorn, the founder's dilemma with my guest, Daniel Liu. Dan, officially welcome to the DM podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. We haven't known each other for that long, but it has been a good time so far to get to know each other. For those that don't know Daniel Liu, can you quickly introduce yourself a little bit about how did you come to be where you are today?
Yeah, of course. Mine is an interesting journey with respect to, it was always going to be finance-led. But in terms of sector, it wasn't clear where I would land. So I have been working in the city, and what I mean by the city is the city of London for the last 15 years. I'm very British from that perspective, but my parents are from Hong Kong, but I was born, raised, studied, and have worked in London my whole career. I first started off my career actually in banking, but as a generalist banker in the city. I think when you are 21, you see the bright lights of London and you just want to get into a big tower somewhere. So that was fun for a little bit. I then was going through the back end of the financial crisis. I wasn't too in love with the sector and industry of where it was headed. I then weirdly decided to go into more of the accounting side of transactions. And so I did that for 3 years at what they call the Big Four. And then for the last 10 years, I've been very focused on outsourced pharma services banking. So I joined a mid-market investment bank with William Blair. We are a global boutique bank. And what I mean by that is we don't play in the very small arena, nor do we play in the very big arena of the JP Morgans. We sit in this spot of where I would say there is a higher volume of transaction. Where I spend my time and where I've landed over the last 10 years leading a lot of our clinical and commercialization efforts from a European perspective. And what I mean by that is any type of market transaction that we do, whether that be mergers, acquisitions, debt, equity, but with a European lens within a broader team of, call it, 120 healthcare bankers globally. So that's kind of really where I found myself. And as I've done more and more, with where appreciating that, from an operational side, you are very today CRO focused. Where I found myself to land is within pharma services, digging deeper and deeper, because I think as the financing, banking, advisory market has moved, no longer is it enough to offer, I would say, a commoditized product in M&A debt or equity, but really having a good understanding alongside, never to the depth that you all have, but at least to someone's understanding of what an operator does in that space has been really, really important. And so that's where I spend my time, from everything across early stage drug discovery through the clinical trials into commercialization, and even tacking on the back end of within the cold chain and the storage of those drugs as well. So that's really sort of where I found myself. And again, I wouldn't say, outsourced pharma or pharma was my first choice. I think I was, quite in love with brands and consumer. But I think in terms of where I found interest in that type of high science was really got what got me going, and that differentiation there.
Very cool. I mean, I like to say that everyone that eventually becomes successful in life, probably even the ones that haven't been, when you look back in your life, usually you look back to a few thoughts that once you connect them, justify or explain how did you get to where you are today. So if you look back to your life, or even as child, what are like the few things that you feel like when this happened, I was like, wow, is a clear touch point that I look back and realize that this made me who I am. So do you have any story like this that you look back to your childhood or even later stages that you'd say, yeah, this made me to get where I am to?
That's a good question. There are perhaps, I try and keep this simple, perhaps 2 points. And one is I guess I would say less important with the grand scheme of things, but an important learning point for me. I was raised with the perspective that education was very important. And so come 16, I did in the UK what you call GCSEs. I would say within context, I did very well. But again, I always strive to be the best that I can. So rather than getting 11 A stars, I got 7 A stars and 4 A's. And for me, that was devastating. But what really taught me was that in that moment, there's no one watching you when you do that exam. It's all down to you and how hard do you want to work to be successful. And so that really resonated with me. And since that point, I think when I go into something, I'm never very half-hearted. I go full in on something, which again can be to my detriment, which is I spend too much time doing this sort of things and I don't look sort of wider than I should. But that was sort of point one. I think point two was really in my career at William Blair, which has guided me to where I am today across becoming a junior banker. You're very much working through process, methodology, following what someone tells you, to ultimately staying in one company, which is rarer in banking nowadays, for over the first 5 years, and then realizing actually this is something I do enjoy. Yes, there are long hours. Yes, there is hard work, but it's in a space that I am enjoying and work that I am doing and meeting really interesting people like yourself as well. So I found that to be lesson number two, which is actually finding something in a place that you like is really, really important. And so that's kind of where I find myself today.
We'll get to this point eventually, back to this, or on doing something we enjoy. But we'll get back to there in a second. Actually, you said something earlier that I wanted to touch upon. There's a huge, perhaps, I wouldn't say misconception, I guess the preconception more than anything, around Asian cultures and families and how they build a discipline and ownership to be the best who you are on a daily basis, which I think is something that the Western society should take page from, because unfortunately we don't have this like culture. But then having this background in Hong Kong, having your kids yourself, and then the family planning. So how does that converse? Are you still trying to build in this, I guess, culture values of being the best you can be on a daily basis every day, only to this discipline that you need to have to be the best that you probably had from your parents, and how do you try to instill that in your kids? And what are the differences too? Because obviously we evolve, right?
No, I think that's right. And I think if you don't evolve and change, you become really archaic, and that word, really traditional. Again, that's not a bad thing. I find myself definitely more in a traditional relationship, and I think that's something I sought, which is given my focus in here. I am on the road a lot, traveling as are you, I assume, working. Um, but I would say where I've landed myself is I think I'm always going to be very thankful to how my parents raised me. They were first generation migrants, quite stereotypical in that sense. I have the benefit of having a hybrid upraising, being British, but also with that Asian culture. And I guess candidly and stereotypically with that very hardworking type of culture, it sort of infused in me. With that said, I have married an English woman. And so actually what that gives me is a real balance, I would say. And that needle of balance moves depending on what the topic is a lot for us raising our children. I think in terms of my own upbringing, it's probably harsher than what the world would accept nowadays. But I do think, as you say, there are points there that can be used to the benefit of the modern world, which is we live in such a world that is so entrepreneurial, fast moving. I think that's really important to capture. So giving the next generation, certainly my children, the ability to be an entrepreneur, I think that's incredibly important versus call it, do your degree, go get a graduate position and go work in a big company for 30 years. I think that's dead. But I think being an entrepreneur doesn't necessarily have to translate to I'm going to go start my own company. I think that seems to be where the world is landing today nowadays. And certainly even my own second brother is now onto his own second venture, and whilst working, a corporate role, but not really focused on that. I think being an entrepreneur within a large corporate can also work. And I think that's something which is new, which a lot of people don't talk about. So is it that you turn up, do 30 years and carry on doing what you do? No, I think it's coming in with a lens of, well, within that role, certainly for me, within the advisory role, finding really interesting companies. How does that change the landscape? And how am I shaping the broader landscape, but with a finance lens, while speaking with operators and piecing that together? That's kind of how I see my role, and therefore having that discipline, hardworking nature. But I really don't believe the attitude of, certainly the stereotypical attitude of, you've got to be a banker, lawyer, doctor. I think that's really archaic. But I also think, hey, go out to the world, just sort of do what you want. I also think there's that balance of guide that next generation to what interests them and help them build something, whether that's on their own or within a large organization.
You said something earlier again, coming back to some earlier words if you said there, and I will try to quote, feel free to correct me. Yeah. Said something along the lines that the way you were raised is probably also not as acceptable at this world, yeah. But at the end, there again, here you are. So to what extent is there, and then by the way, opening up my sketch, I lived in 19 different houses by the time I was 18 years old. Yeah, so it wasn't easy. And I'm not saying that it was easy. And I'm not trying to sell that, it was the easiest journey of my life. Obviously changed at school, often changing in cities, often and so forth. So that also made me who I am. Yeah, so this ability to, for example, make friends by this, yeah, that came into me by this life story that I had. And I can only be proud of it there, because even though at the time it was this period of suffering, in other words, it now translated in a very positive thing. And perhaps, I'm not saying that that's the case, but questioning whether perhaps today's society is being too soft in a way, because this idea that you had and the same life that I had perhaps is seen upon like, this is not okay to raise your child like this. But is that now perhaps building a softer generation than perhaps the two of us were raised like? And how are you trying to, while having a balance, which an English wife and yourself, keeping this somewhat stricter side of education while also giving them the freedom? Yeah, because obviously we cannot be only on one side of the table. But how is that changing, right? So from the way you were raised, the way you're raising your kids.
Yeah, yeah. And perhaps what I won't do is be a broken record speaking around the migrant story piece, but there's another bit to it which I think is also new, which is, I think you're right in terms of, at least the way the world is moving is giving children opportunity, lesson involved. And I think that is so, so important. And that's perhaps by where we have come from, which is where the world is a harsher place, whether that be with more rules or nothing's given to you on a plate. I think certainly where I am, which is, I recognize a more privileged position, certainly where we were, just to touch on that. So you understand that background. We were two families with 4 children at the time, of which I was one of the 4, with a grandma and a great grandma, living above a Chinese takeaway in South London, across 3 bedrooms with no living room. So that's kind of where we came from to, I think, where I am now, which is, and my family, a much more privileged position. And that has come from the hard work. So we made our living from owning Chinese takeaways, which again is very stereotypical. I keep using that word because I think there is so much narrative on that. But I do think there have been so many benefits from that, which is the family values, the hardworking nature to what we needed to do to get to where we are. And I think the concept of, well, if you don't work hard, that person next to you is going to be working harder. And so are you going to miss the opportunity? And I think that resounds through all of business. It's cutthroat. If you're static and not evolving, then where are you going to go? And so these sort of lessons, I think I'm trying to find ways of teaching my children, which isn't necessarily, veering towards the stick, nor is it towards the carrot. And it is really, really tricky, even to where we are with school selection. Appreciating in London, there is an old school way of where you have single sex schools, which isn't so normal. I recognize across whether it's US, Europe, or even globally. But having looked at my oldest is now 4 years old, we went and looked at a school. And again, we can recognize it's super high achieving. There are 15 children in the room, and probably all 15 of them will go on to play some type of instrument, sport, or be the best. And we walked in and we were like, well, actually making that conscious decision, well, we'll give some of that at home, but do we want that for our children in a modern world where you are not reflecting society? So where we've landed is, again, very privileged to be able to put them into a private school, but very mixed with much more of a holistic learning. So be the best that you can be, but within these boundaries. And I think that's kind of where I'm landing with that point. But coming back to really just the nail of, are we being too soft? My honest view is, I think perhaps slightly, but I don't know where the balance is. And I think only you can decide within yourself with where you land, especially whether it be personal life, business, and how and if you segment them. I don't really segment my business life and personal to that extent. So a lot is worked around that. But I don't know if you have any perspectives there or
Yeah,
a view.
I mean, to be honest, the reason I'm raising this topic is I think in today's world, with the technology we develop, and AI specifically, we are perhaps building, I will be defined as a monster in all its goods and bads, if you know what I'm trying to say, which is the way you and I were raised is to question, to learn, and then to apply. No? This is how we were, in my opinion, this was how I was raised from early days in school to late days in school. Yeah. There's no such a thing as a de facto question, which is like, you can't question this. Yeah, you need to question everything and the world around you. And then from there, make your own assumption and your own thoughts. Today, what you see most a new generation coming into the ranks is, I have a question, I go to ChatGPT, I ask it, I have an answer. Without questioning the answer, without questioning the sources, and without the end thinking whether these make sense. Yeah. So my biggest fear for the future of the society is that the new generations who come will be trained this way. Yeah. And from the day, and I'm sure you were too, first where we barely had phones in the early stages, and we did have those phones that you're not allowed them in school or in class. You couldn't even dare to do that. Yeah, even doing a piece of work in the computer was like, yeah, but which sources are you using this for? Yeah, which books did you read? Which articles did you read? And I think we are missing out on this piece of time, yeah, because we are using these models to generate this response. And then obviously, here I am building an AI company myself. But on the topic of education, it could lead into a huge generational gap. You know? Obviously, if you look historically, we had a lot of generational gaps, but never steering away from looking for sources, looking for information, digesting it, and eventually that is the way we educate the people from many, many days. So with this change, what will happen to the future? And that's why I was alluding to when I was trying to understand how you see this world, because obviously, while I'm taking this to a higher level on the AIT specifically, the reality is that those good old ways also taught something to people, the resilience, the discipline, the not taking no for an answer and trying to find your answer was built also through our educational systems, which I guess it's harder and harder to build in the future. So that's where my position is that while we are building this amazing technology, we need to continuously teaching kids how to think, yeah, how to rationalize whether this is a good idea or this is not a good area. So these reasoning behind things and to eventually make up your own mind. Because a world where we all believe the same, because ChatGPT was trained in one way, is a very dangerous world. It's a world where someone else is controlling this information and not just the books, not just the teachers, not all this Google world where you could Google it and see 50 different links for the same question, right? So controversially or not, perhaps I'm more against AI in education than not.
Yeah.
But that's where my position is.
It is an interesting point if we bring it to the tech piece specifically. And there's this whole argument about, for example, how early on do you introduce an iPad or technology? It's really tricky to know where the world will be in 10 years. If we all did, we wouldn't be sat here having this type of conversation. Does it teach other skills that we're not seeing? To your point, will there be a cohort within that can question the data integrity and actually build something more? I don't know. But you're right, the majority will take what's given. And even in our work today, whether that be, I guess in the CRO world or in the banking world, information is so easy to come by. But how do you digest that, process that, and then use it to your benefit in a way that it's not commoditized? I think that's very different as well. Does it also increase by virtue of having all of that information, doing more, I guess, more volume of whatever activity it may be? Does that increase the failure rate of what you're used to, and therefore you get used to rejection more, and you actually become more resilient in that way? it's hard to know how all of this will affect. But I think you're right. It all comes down to some sort of balance within there, because you can't just say, read that book nowadays and you'll learn everything from that textbook. But how do you ingest that type of information and implement it into your processes as a person? And I think that's the hardest thing. We are all trying to decipher the use cases for our respective businesses and work.
I fully agree, by the way. And perhaps continuing on the topic of education, that's steering away a little bit from you too. Looking back throughout your career as a pathwacker and helping founders selling tech companies eventually, which I guess most of cases, so the deep allude to how many are actually founder and on, I guess most of them would be. What were your learning points from founders? And perhaps what were the traits you started identifying in founders that not only lead successful businesses, but also eventually exit successful business? Is there commonalities, is there common trends?
It's really hard to nail on saying a founder has to have these traits here. I candidly have done, call it 30 to 50 transactions in my career and seen many, many CEOs, management teams, etc. But I would certainly can say there are different types of personalities. All can be successful, but certainly I've identifying a few of those have been important in therefore seeing, well, that business is going to skyrocket, or it has a chance of really growing and becoming the next DBD or the next Icon or the next big company again is for multi-billion, the next Quintiles, IQVIA, etc. And I think it actually reflects both on the CEO, but also the type of business you're building. Is it a business that has huge focus and is technically led? That's one way of looking at it. Is it a business that has a specific therapeutic area with a combo of a CEO who is a great personality and just has the ability to be able to sell that more generic solution of product, but within a specific therapeutic area modality across that customer set? So I think it's almost like a menu of within these things, the type of personality of the founder, the CEO, or even of the management team, what the business is trying to solve, and it has to solve a solution. I can also deliver an outcome on a business that just does more of the same, but does that deliver an outsized outcome? It's less, but does it deliver perhaps some level of generational wealth for that founder? Yes. But really the businesses that skyrocket are those who have a very, I would say actually the ones that have really delivered, and I speak with a pharma services lens on, are those that have solved a very specific solution within the very big world, whether that be providing one very specific service within drug discovery, or as you are doing at Biorce, providing within clinical trials, this AI solution set here, led with this, but broadening out the portfolio? Or is it that further downstream, you have some specific product that no one else can design or make that you're able to? That coupled with a very strong founder and management team are parts of the recipe for the success of that business. Now, I think delivering an outcome and hopefully, a sale or some sort of exit event is typically what a founder looks for, unless you want to keep it within multiple generations. Now that's a different story. But those are the types of things I think that then deliver a really outsized outcome for founders.
We actually have a discussion, I believe you might be motivated anyway today or tomorrow, which is to parachute or to unicorn. And actually, I think we discussed this ourselves in the past as well, which is obviously when we explaining to the audience before we get it deep into it. Do you then go to the $1 billion business, or do you maybe parachute halfway through or whichever way through and make a significant exit, like you said, generational wealth for the founder and probably also for the founding team and the rest of the shareholders, but without necessarily making to this level of unicorn? And it's so, I guess, publicly talked about and perhaps even in addition by most. And we'll then get into another topic after that about unicorns, but let's start to this. What's your mindset there? What do you suggest to founders as well when they come to you? And also, if you were yourself a founder, what would you prefer to do if you were in those shoes?
It's a really good question. And I'm not going to give one straight answer because I think it's so situation dependent. And this comes back to what was that point I said about the personality and reading that individual and what they are. I would put myself as a bit of entrepreneur within the space I operate in, but certainly more of a risk-averse individual. I think I've identified that within myself. And so if I saw that situation of I've built a business, I can create generational wealth, I'm guided by my history and my experience. I think to some level, I wouldn't, what I call, fully roll everything to then go through another round. Say you go through series A, B, C, D, crossover, then we'll go to the IP. I perhaps would have liquidated a large chunk up front, and that's a personal decision, no matter what I would have built. And I think a lot of people will do that anyway along the way, because you're just trying to mitigate risk. But it all comes down to how risk-taking are you as an individual and what's your background. And so this is where I say it's hard for me to give a specific answer. My role is to give solutions and a set and present them. Very often, I'm not the one who has to make the decision, which is quite lucky, I guess, which is why I do what I do. But I think you've got to really look at, where are we with the business? What's our journey been? Where are we with funding? And really, where are we across all these various points of, I think, the classic to IPO or not, or is there an exit event, or have we now got private equity money? I can liquidate some of that now and roll it into a continuation vehicle. There are so many more options nowadays beyond just, do we hold it, sell it, IPO it? There is, can you recapitalize it? Is there interesting structuring? What are your objectives? I think that's the number one. What are your objectives as a founder? And that's why I can't answer that question. I think if your business is skyrocketing and there's a clear path to delivering, a capital market solution and an IPO, that makes a lot of sense. But the market has to be compliant, and you have no control over the IPO market.
Perhaps at the risk of making some NNDP theories, I will say this. We are probably in a place now where we see more and more unicorns showing up, but also more and more unicorns without a chance to public markets. And we are talking about season they have the podcast. Yeah. And for a founder, usually, because the entrepreneurial spirit is so big, you eventually get to a point where you feel it in your bone, you need to go off and do something else. Yeah. But yet, if you do go down that unicorn chain, eventually, or that's at least what we see today in this current market, you'll get stuck with a PE firm and eventually become an employee in your own company, even though you still own a chunk of share.
Yeah.
Then you have a boss to report to, which is about measurements of KPIs and metrics, and you need to be delivering with them. So with that side of the current situation that we see, have you seen more and more, I guess, companies going through that next end, whichever five is, where founders actually just want out versus where founders are continuously evolving and eventually getting to this gap of bubble of unicorns that basically cannot exit fully? Have you seen this as a trend as well? Then why do you perhaps that this is happening? Do you think it's because the situation in the public markets? Is it just because perhaps in private markets we have a different way without having as much pressure and stress from the public markets? What do you think is causing this current bubble? Perhaps what is their own term.
Yeah, circle. And at the crux of it, there have been a ton of headwinds within the global macroeconomy that puts broader uncertainty into, therefore, the ability to do business freely, which has led to capital markets being less of an opportunity. I would say within that, you then also have to break out for specific firms, depending on where you play within the pharma continuum, of what that looks like for you and what your solutions. For some companies in biotech, private markets aren't a solution. There isn't the option. I think what people have seen with a weaker market, particularly with all of us sat here in this room with the European lens on, is that our markets are weaker than the US. But however, what if your business is all European in nature? Does that make it more tricky? Whilst the trend is to go list on NASDAQ, whatever it may be, then what is your solution? So when I talk about that menu of solutions, what then do you do? And actually, you're finding now they don't, especially private equity. I think VC a bit more flexible in terms of profitability, but certainly private equity are now playing down in terms of what they can underwrite, in terms of both size and risk appetite. And they offer you a fairly quick solution very quietly to, as you say, liquidate some of your investment, but also see some of their upside with further down the line an opportunity to when markets do pick up, list or have a capital market event for you. And I think that's what's changing. And what you're also seeing within healthcare is a huge pool of now very healthcare or pharma services focused businesses coming through, looking for these types of opportunities to really understand the market. And within their own ecosystem can drive growth for business like Biorce or like any other business within that sort of end-to-end. I think they're just seeing huge opportunity, great expertise, and the ability to underwrite that, whereas founders are seeing, well, this is my baby. I see so much more value here. What's my options?
Maybe to finalize with one last question. In your space, you see a lot of startups, obviously, and even scaling companies already, scale-ups, whatever you would define as. What are you seeing today in the clinical trial space that is interesting you, but also interesting the buyers? Because ultimately, that's also you serve quite often.
And this isn't because this is what you do. Genuinely, finding the tech enablement within clinical trials, what are the use cases and which companies are addressing and finding a solution to that. And I think that's how I came across yourself and your company, by finding what companies are leading with tech and AI and what is the use case for that, whether that be, companies who are finding solutions within the patient recruitment. Is it the writing of the dossiers? Where is it that you're finding a solution and ultimately helping pharma bring a drug through development into commercialization quicker, more effectively, more efficiently? Wherever you get to with that is what excites me and is really interesting. And I guess if it makes you excited and interested, it will make an investor. What do they care about? How does that make them money? But what I do see is, how do you get to a point where you are able to implement these types of AI tech-enabled solutions where you are truly a pharma tech company, which is then sought after by the pharma? Where does that then take pharma, whether it's drug discovery through like in silico? Then you get to clinical trials, which is then AI driven. Then you get through to the commercialization, which, you still need medical writers, but you need less of them because there's AI to digest that data. So you get to a point where both the time to bring a drug to market increases, but the tools you're using shape what you become as a company, whether that's pharma, to the point where pharma is almost unrecognizable and becomes just purely a pharma tech company through all of this, whether they outsource all of this or insource some of it because they can increase the speed so much that they then become a tech company in that sense. That's like a crazy concept, but using that and changing the face of essentially clinical trials all the way along through, I call it drug discovery clinical trials within there, the use cases there that, you're addressing. And then also as far as into commercialization, efficiencies across the delivery of those drugs. I think that's really, really exciting and important. And that certainly is, I think, a huge, huge point for investors to understand within this space of how is that used? How is that tech enablement, AI, digital, these use cases? What is that? I don't think anyone has a solid answer.
I don't think we do. I was actually going to ask you, would you say trials in 5 years? But I guess it would be more than anything a crystal ball, yes. So I guess we'll probably hopefully be still here in 5 years to see how that happens. And maybe we do this again in 5 years and let
That'd be easy to see.
what has happened and how much has it evolved. Daniel, it was a pleasure to have you.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.